He was the silky voice that transformed the Doobie Brothers from denim-clad rockers to smooth radio royalty. But behind the soulful melodies and million-dollar hits, there was tension, quiet glances, unspoken resentment, and a band splintering under the weight of its own reinvention. For decades, Michael McDonald stayed silent about what really happened when he joined the Doobies. Now, at 72, he's finally breaking that silence. Why did his arrival fracture the band's identity? And who paid the price? Let's find out. Before the stadium tours, the Grammys, and the unmistakable voice that defined a generation, Michael McDonald was just another session musician, grinding away in the shadows of other people's spotlights. Born in St. Louis, he cut his teeth playing local gigs before heading to Los Angeles in the early 70s. There, he became a sought-after background vocalist and keyboardist, eventually catching the attention of Steely Dan. Touring with Steely Dan taught McDonald precision, discipline, and subtlety, but it didn't make him a star. That came in 1975, when fate and a medical emergency intervened. Doobie Brothers frontman Tom Johnston was sidelined with a bleeding ulcer in the middle of a tour. The band needed a quick replacement. McDonald stepped in to help finish the shows. At first, it was temporary, but McDonald's sound, soulful, gospel-tinged, and utterly unlike the band's previous frontmen, changed everything. The crowds responded, radio responded, and the label, smelling a new kind of success, encouraged it. Suddenly, the backup singer was writing lead singles. Songs like Takin' It to the Streets and Minute by Minute weren't just hits, they were seismic shifts. The band was evolving, but not everyone wanted to evolve. Inside the Doobie Brothers, fractures were forming, and they all pointed back to Michael. Tom Johnston wasn't just the Doobie Brothers' lead singer, he was their spirit. A founding member with a gravelly blues rock voice and a stage presence that could fill arenas. He wrote their early hits, China Grove, Long Train Runnin', Listen to the Music. This was his band, but in 1975, everything changed. Mid-tour, Johnston collapsed from exhaustion and internal bleeding. He was rushed to the hospital. The diagnosis was dire: ulcers, worsened by stress and relentless touring. The Doobies had commitments. Venues booked, tickets sold. They needed a stand-in, and fast. In came Michael McDonald. At first, the shift seemed respectful, just a temporary substitution. But when Johnston returned, he found the band changed. McDonald's songs were gaining traction. His voice was dominating the next album's demos, and the label was pressuring them to go more soulful. Behind closed doors, decisions were being made without him. Johnston was sidelined, less by health than by momentum. The band he'd built was now riding a different wave, one he didn't recognize. He quietly stepped away in 1977, officially citing health reasons. But those close to the band knew better. He'd been pushed out, politely, perhaps, but firmly. Michael hadn't taken over by force. He'd done it by being irreplaceable. By 1978, the Doobie Brothers sounded like an entirely different band. Gone were the bluesy riffs and three-part harmonies that once defined them. In their place, synthesizers, Rhodes pianos, and Michael McDonald's unmistakable croon. Minute by Minute went multi-platinum. What a Fool Believes won Song of the Year at the Grammys. The industry applauded. Radio adored them. But internally, the band was unraveling. Fans who loved the biker bar grit of early Doobies didn't know what to make of this soft focus, soul-injected transformation. Longtime members like Jeff "Skunk" Baxter and John Hartman reportedly felt musically alienated. Creative decisions now orbited McDonald. Rehearsals felt like solo projects, and backstage, resentment brewed. They weren't just touring behind new material, they were touring behind his material. It wasn't personal, but it was unignorable. Michael's voice had become the brand. Some called it evolution, others called it surrender. The press labeled it yacht rock, a term that would haunt McDonald for decades. It wasn't meant as a compliment. It implied smoothness without substance, music for rich people on boats. And though McDonald himself resented the term, it stuck. The Doobie Brothers were still winning awards, but they were losing themselves. The band was now Michael's, and that wasn't what any of them had signed up for. As the Doobie Brothers morphed into the Michael McDonald era, something more subtle and more permanent began reshaping the band. Paperwork, new contracts, revisions to old ones, royalty allocations, publishing rights. In the music industry, where loyalty is easily replaced with litigation, the fine print often tells the real story. When McDonald joined, he was brought in as a hired hand, tour support, session help, a stand-in. But as his songs began charting, the label and management saw a future in him, a very profitable one. His role evolved, and so did his contractual power. He began earning co-writing credits, then production influence, then full songwriting control. Meanwhile, founding members watched their shares dilute. According to insiders, older Doobies started noticing discrepancies in publishing checks. McDonald's name appeared more and more, while theirs faded from the liner notes. And once you lose songwriting credit, you lose control of direction, royalties, and eventually, identity. Some argued that McDonald earned every credit. He wrote the hits. He brought the band back from the brink. But others saw it differently, as a takeover hidden behind legal language. A band built on brotherhood was now guided by clauses, lawyers, and label pressure. They never fought publicly. But the silence said enough. The ink had settled. So had the power. In the studio, everything was polite, professional, cordial even. But underneath the harmonies and pristine production, there was a split. Two visions for one band. McDonald's style leaned inward. He layered lush chord progressions, leaned into melancholy, sought perfection. Every note had to be immaculate. It was less about jamming and more about sculpting. The sound shifted from communal to curated. Band members who once played off each other in real time now waited for their part to be added later, often pieced together by McDonald and producer Ted Templeman. Older members, especially those who thrived in the gritty, live-take ethos, felt sidelined. The energy that once sparked in early Doobie's albums was gone, replaced by a chill professionalism. Skunk Baxter later hinted in interviews that the sessions lost their soul. It became less of a band, he said, more of a project. The sessions for Minute by Minute were the turning point. McDonald was no longer the new guy. He was the axis. His meticulousness brought acclaim, but also fatigue. Some bandmates simply didn't show up. Others played their parts and left, like studio musicians. Nobody said it outright, but everyone knew. This wasn't the Doobie Brothers anymore. This was Michael McDonald, and the rest were orbiting. It was 1980, backstage at a tour stop in Cincinnati. Tensions had been simmering for months. Missed rehearsals, short tempers, passive-aggressive comments buried beneath professionalism. But on that night, something snapped. Accounts vary, but the story goes like this. A disagreement over the set list turned into a shouting match. Not between McDonald and an outsider, but between McDonald and founding drummer John Hartman. Hartman accused him of turning the band into a solo act with backup singers. McDonald, usually reserved, didn't back down. Other bandmates stepped in to cool things down, but the damage was done. What had once been subtle resentment now had a voice. That night, Hartman packed his gear and didn't return for the rest of the tour. He wasn't officially fired, he just left, like others would soon after. The band finished the tour, but the dynamic had shifted irreparably. On stage, they still smiled, still played the hits, but behind the scenes, loyalty had fractured. McDonald didn't want a fight. He wasn't trying to destroy a legacy, but by just being himself, by doing what he was best at, he'd changed the DNA of the band. That night in Cincinnati was never in the press, but for those inside the circle, it marked the beginning of the end. By 1981, even Michael McDonald had grown tired of being Michael McDonald. The pressure to carry the band's creative weight, the unspoken tensions, the relentless grind, it was all taking a toll. Behind the success was exhaustion. And for McDonald, the very role that had elevated him now felt like a trap. He approached the band quietly, suggesting that maybe it was time for a break. Maybe he could step back, let the group rediscover its roots. But by then, the industry machine had latched onto his voice like a brand logo. The label wasn't interested in a different direction. They wanted another minute by minute. More ballads, more soft hits, more Michael. Privately, McDonald had already begun experimenting with solo work. He missed collaborating freely, without the weight of expectations, without the Doobie name hanging over every chord. But he was cautious, still loyal to the band that had given him a platform. Still unsure if he'd be accepted alone, the other members sensed it. They'd seen it before. Artists looking for exits without saying so. But what stung was the irony. McDonald, the man whose presence had nearly broken the band, now wanted out. And yet, when he finally did leave, there was no dramatic split, no press release war, just a quiet goodbye. The smooth voice that had transformed the band drifted away. In the decades that followed, the Doobie Brothers became a legacy act, reuniting for tours, awards, and nostalgia-fueled television appearances. Michael McDonald would occasionally rejoin them, his voice older, but still unmistakable. On stage, it all looked like forgiveness, harmony, brotherhood restored. But between shows, the silence lingered. In interviews, McDonald rarely spoke of the old tensions. When asked, he deflected with grace. Every band has its ups and downs, he'd say, but others weren't as diplomatic. Jeff Baxter and Tom Johnston offered veiled critiques. Not attacks, but reminders. "We were a rock band," Johnston once said, "until we weren't." Offstage, the band traveled separately, rehearsed separately. Even press appearances were managed carefully to avoid overlap. There was no public animosity, but also no closeness. Just the choreography of professionalism. Fans wanted to believe in the fairy tale ending, that old wounds had healed, that the band's evolution had come full circle. But the truth was more complex. Some wounds had simply scabbed over. Others had never closed. They played the songs, smiled for the cameras, but behind the harmony was a kind of practiced distance, the silence of people who once changed each other's lives and then moved on. It took 5 decades for Michael McDonald to tell the truth, and when he finally did, it wasn't in a headline or a book tour. It was in a quiet podcast interview released just months after his 72nd birthday. He spoke slowly, carefully, not about blame, but about regret, about how unprepared he was for the role he stepped into, how he never wanted to take over the Doobie Brothers. He just didn't know how to say no. "I was filling in," he said, "and suddenly, I wasn't. I became the thing I thought I was helping to hold together." He admitted he stayed silent when others stepped back, that he felt guilt over how the band shifted around him, that he sometimes wished he'd walked away sooner, not out of disrespect, but out of respect for what the band had been before him. It wasn't a bombshell. It wasn't bitter. It was a man, older now, looking back at a life shaped by accident, opportunity, and unintended consequence. McDonald didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't need to. He simply told the truth, for the first time. And it was enough to change how we remembered everything. He saved the band. He split the band. He took them to the Grammys and took them away from their roots. Michael McDonald wasn't born a Doobie Brother, and for many, he never truly became one. Not in the way Tom Johnston was, not in the way the original lineup was. He was a different era, a different sound, a different identity. But maybe that's the point. McDonald was never supposed to be a savior. He was supposed to be a temporary fix. Instead, he became the most recognizable part of a band that didn't know it was changing until it was too late. And maybe he wasn't really a Doobie Brother in the traditional sense. Maybe that's why it worked, and why it broke. His voice became legend. His era, controversial. His legacy, complicated. But love him or resent him, Michael McDonald turned the Doobie Brothers into something unforgettable. Not by accident, not by force, but by simply doing what no one else could. Michael McDonald didn't just join the Doobie Brothers, he altered their course forever. His voice brought fame, but also fracture. And the story behind that transformation was never as smooth as the music made it seem. If the truth surprised you, subscribe for more untold legacies. The past is never finished. It's just unfinished business.